name is Mark Weiner, and we have a terrific group speaking today, beginning with Pekka Sulkunen from the University of Helsinki, who will be speaking on Nordic welfare states under attack, the uneasy blend of autonomy and intimacy against normative homogeneity. I think what I'd like to do is give each speaker 15 minutes for their presentations, then take one, possibly a second question directed specifically to that speaker, and then go on to the next speaker, and then we'll have plenty of time, I hope, for discussion questions that we have. So, without further ado.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and many thanks to David who put me on the program in the last minute. I wanted to come again because I found the Telos conference is very stimulating, and particularly this year the theme was interesting for me because it's particularly the theme I'm currently working on. I'm not so sure, though, that we are actually living in a world after the welfare state. In fact, one of the big issues in the sociology of knowledge about the welfare state is that after all these criticisms and moratories on the welfare state since the fiscal crisis debate in the 70s, very little has changed. Well, here's one example of these criticisms and moratories. The welfare state is expensive, inflexible, authoritarian. It regulates with stiff norms, centralized. It interferes with people's private lives and so on. But in fact, what we find in welfare state research, particularly in the Nordic countries, but also for the whole of Europe, is great resilience. Income maintenance, social insurance expenses have not been reduced. Social security and health expenditures have increased rather than decreased. Spending on public health care services has increased. European integration seems to be converging upwards, not downwards, and public health and public education has not even been threatened. The popular support is very strong. The welfare states are not only resilient, but they are also popular. So something seems to be wrong. Either we don't should trust what we hear in the experts' evidence, or then we do not hear the right things in the critique. Now, welfare state research is of little help in here because it focuses on distributions, outcomes, systems, and popular support, but it says very little about the state itself. Therefore, we need to look at the sociologies of the welfare state, and I have only taken up here two starting points. One is Montesquieu, who was one of the early Enlightenment theorists who claimed that the states are in debt to citizens simply for having them as their members. Montesquieu, in this way, is one of the many Enlightenment thinkers who turns around the Hobbesian and Rousseauian idea of debt of individuals to the state for guaranteeing their lives in Hobbes, for implementing the general will of the people in Rousseau. This is one of the streams of thought that still continue in some of the discourses and practices of the welfare states in the Nordic countries as well as elsewhere in Europe. The second starting point is Durkheim, who participated in the controversies about the Republic by saying that in Rousseauian republic, there's nothing between the individual and the state. The state is everything and nothing. Instead, he thought that both the individual and the state are products products of the social. This is the point that Donzelot made in his very nice, wonderful book on l'invention du social in 1984 already. For the Durkheimian solidarists like Léon Bourgeois, the idea of solidarity was turned into a political program that argues that the state actually not only is a product of the social, but it also should produce the individuals and their autonomy. And this is both the state's goal and its justification. The Durkheimian primacy of the social opens the way to representative democracy as an instrument to enforce the will of the people. So building solidarities and building on them is to recognize the state's debt to citizens and their obligations to the state. Now, in the Nordic case, we have to observe three important points about this. One is that before the construction of the welfare state, there were strong local community ties. The individuals were not alone facing the state. They were facing the state as part of communities. They were tied to very strong dependencies between with the so-called patron, masters of the industry, of the farm, and of the house, and their workers, especially for women. And then thirdly, there was a strong connection between the king and the king's subject as a guarantee of rights against the abuses of power by local lords. This was done through the Lutheran state churches since the 16th century already. So this was a very strong connection between the state and the people. The welfare state was to liberate individuals from these traditional ties, to establish universal legal and political citizenship, to allow a labor force mobility also for women, and to solve the population questions, which had two aspects to it: low fertility and degeneration, which was feared to be the fate of small nations unless something was done about that. The individual family was the model and also the instrument, and even more strongly the object of governance. This process of building the welfare state started early on in the late 19th century with the criminal justice reforms. It developed into universal suffrage from 1905 in Finland, later in other Nordic countries, religious freedom acts from 1922, primary school reforms, and so on. And the male breadwinner model was the basis on which all of this was built. Now, the Myrdalian modern individual, in their book, in the book by Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, who were the founding couple of the Swedish social democracy in the 30s, the stress was on the autonomy of the individual, who had to be able to control their own biography, their career, education, their family alliances, and so on. They had to have an autonomy as citizens and legal and political subjects to do this, and they also were expected to develop a sense of intimacy, their authenticity as separate individuals from others. Now, in this program, which emphasizes the task of the welfare state to liberate individuals from their traditional ties. The principles, the two principles, Montesquieu's principle of the debt of state to citizens and the Lacanian principle of the primacy of the social, were compatible, but they are not compatible today, and this is my argument. Now, this kind of welfare state development fits very well the metaphor that Michel Foucault used about the welfare state as pastoral forms of governance. There's one shepherd and one flock, there's the population, and its welfare and health, which are the biopolitical objects of governance. There's one flock and one shepherd, which means that there's one national population and one central state, the centralized national state, to govern them. The shepherd brings back those sheep is one aspect of this metaphor, which refers here to inclusive individualism, correctional, therapeutic, or penal welfarism. The shepherd leads the herd to new pastures. The welfare state justification was very strongly based on the idea of progress, future. It was also egalitarian, and it was very strongly focused on controlling the needs of the people in the areas of sexuality, consumption, housing, role-making, and child rearing, leisure, culture, everything. Which meant that the welfare state building in the early phase was very normative, and the pressure towards uniformity was very high. There were two critiques about this process. One of them was about the incompleteness of universal autonomy. The state's debt to citizens was felt not to be delivered. Women, minorities, deviant populations were not given the equal rights as legal and political subjects. Therapeutic welfarism leads to human rights violations. There were tens of thousands of incarcerated people for drinking, for living lives that are not in conformity with the normative order. There was felt to be a bias towards the bourgeois lifestyle model, and the centralized cultural and educational policy was considered to be hegemonic and oriented towards the national Lutheran conservatism. The other critique was about the repression of intimacy, like D.H. Lawrence says, it was preventing the self to come into its own fullness of being. Lawrence was one of the popular writers, much read in the 60s in the Nordic countries. This duality of capitalist culture for me personally was very important to read Daniel Bell's Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, but the same duality came forth in many other books later on. The repression of intimacy aroused movements of intellectual turmoil in what I call bedroom Marxism, which was a critical critique of transcapitalization of private life. There was a critique of commodification of human experience, and many kinds of feminisms, masculinity studies, naturalisms, sociology of the body, and so on, which were critical of this repression. Now, these critiques did not lead to any dismantling or even weakening of the welfare state development, which was being consolidated or strengthened since beginning or accelerating in the 1960s. On the contrary, the process of building the welfare state was intensified. But not to talk about dismantling, it did get transformed. There were changing justifications and practices of governance, and particularly from the 1980s onwards. The autonomy of the citizen as a result of these legal and policy reforms came to be taken for granted, and it was no longer an ideal but became gradually a condition of belonging to society, a condition for having the rights of the citizens and for being the creditor of the state in debt to citizenship. And there was a tendency to underline human rights, to protect the differences and intimacies of individuals, and so the result of all this was that consolidating the welfare state made it necessary to relax the pressure toward uniformity. The family-centered Lutheran nationalist conservatism. Now, this led to changes in not only in the discourses on the welfare state, but on its structure. I call this a move from pastoral to epistolary mode of governance, which replaces normative orders with apostolic letters of instruction or epistles to society sent to guide them with abstract goals, but it was not addressed to the whole citizenry. It was addressed to the faithful, requiring voluntary participation. Instead of binding orders, contracts of reciprocity are made between the citizens and the state. Instead of imposing one life form on everybody, the state applies the ethical rule of not taking a stand. All this was an attempt to resolve the conflict on the one hand between the state and the debtor, and the state the social, the Montesquieuian and the Durkheimian way of justifying the welfare state. Now they become contradictory. Secondly, the pastoral, the epistolary mode of governance is an attempt to resolve the conflict between citizens' right to protection and citizens' right to difference and intimacy. So, the conclusion is that the attacks of the welfare state are not provoked, yes, but not caused by external shocks or economic plights, as it is often seen or thought to be. The actual situation is that the welfare state crisis has become permanent, and it consists of two internal contradictions rather than external exigencies. The first of these contradictions is the conflict between the state's debt to protect its citizens and the state as the product of the social and executor of the will of the people. And the second contradiction is the conflict between the citizens' autonomy and their intimacy. Now, the permanent crisis of the welfare state results not from the failure of the welfare state, but from its success in liberating the individual from traditional ties and from the power of the pastoral totalitarian state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have only 3 panelists, so we have some luxury of time. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to pose to Pekka now, individually? Otherwise, we can move on to the other panelists.
I have
Yes.
one question. In this country that you're talking about, was there unionization, where there's the problem of striking unions? I noticed it said at some point they had the 8-hour day. It seemed like it looked like it was earlier than, let's say, the 8-hour day came to the United States. And the United States involved a lot of strikes and unions and stuff. And I just wondered if it was there too.
Unionization is at a very high level in the Nordic countries, all of them, but particularly in Finland, still today. They are becoming weaker and weaker, but it is true that it's often called corporatism, but also the historic welfare state wanted to get rid of this corporatism intentionally to strengthen the autonomy, not only the autonomy of the individual, but the autonomy of the state as well, which was a way of getting rid of the sort of the three-party negotiations on every political issue, whether unions, the government, and the political parties were all members around the same table.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Yes, one.
You said that actually the welfare state liberated the individual from the traditional structure and so on. But doesn't it mean that at the same time it actually changed one system of subjection with another one, with that of the welfare state? Because the individual who was previously subjected to traditional institution, now he is subjected also, but to much more modern ones.
I was not able to stress strongly enough that there was a clear turn of the mode of governance in the development of the welfare state. Actually, the welfare state institutions were only set up from the 60s onwards until about 1980, 1990s, somewhere there. And gradually, as this process developed, the kind of conservative, Lutheran, nationalist, family-centered ideology, which was very homogenizing, very strong pressure to uniformity, degraded or splintered, so that the state became more protective of individual freedom, less normative in terms of what people should, how people should live, what they should consume, what kind of sex life they should have, and so on. So there was a drift towards a kind of more neutralized state in terms of normative constraints.
I know there are some other good questions, but in the interest of the queue, I'll put Sam and then Anna first on the queue at the end, but we have all our questions together, and we'll move to the second talk, which is not a very different topic. We're going from Finnish social democratic welfare corporatist solidarity to negative solidarity in the new right. Our speaker is Chet Lisiecki from Colorado College.
This paper sort of proceeds from the notion that Hannah Arendt's work on totalitarianism might also speak to the urgency of mutual aid in a post-fascist political landscape. And it'll be mostly on Hannah Arendt. I didn't quite get to the second part of the title, as happens sometimes. The masked man, she writes, in the origins of totalitarianism emerged from the, quote, breakdown of the class system, which led to the, quote, breakdown of the party system, chiefly because these parties, being interest parties, could no longer represent class interests. Instead, there is a, quote, great unorganized, structureless mass of furious individuals who had nothing in common except their vague apprehension that the hopes of party members were doomed, that consequently the most respected, articulate, and representative members of the community were fools, and that all the powers that be were not so much evil as they were equally stupid and fraudulent. End quote. She's fun to quote. Arendt refers to this as a, quote, new, terrifying, negative solidarity, end quote, whereby a nonpartisan mass of dissatisfied and desperate men is formed and maintained through the particular affective dispositions of fury and apprehension. Those are the words she uses. Negative solidarity, she writes, is quote, repeated again and again in individual isolation, but is, quote, not a common bond despite its tendency to extinguish individual differences, end quote. Ken Roshore, in a 1992 article on Arendt's Understanding of Solidarity, writes that for Arendt, authentic solidarity, quote, authentic solidarity is founded on and informed by the facts, not feelings, especially those which are thought to be vicarious, end quote. So negative solidarity thus expresses itself through collective destructive action resulting from affective contagion, mimesis, impulse, fury. It nonetheless operates with the logic of conspiracy, which Arendt calls the tyranny of logicality. In her discussion of this phenomenon, Arendt associates the loneliness of the mass man with feelings of uprootedness and superfluousness, quote, which have been the curse of modern masses since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and have become acute with the rise of imperialism at the end of the last century and the breakdown of political institutions and social traditions in our own time, end quote. In loneliness, quote, man loses trust in himself as the partner of his thoughts and that elementary confidence in the world which is necessary to make experiences at all. Self and world, capacity for thought and experience are lost at the same time. The fact that loneliness has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century, she argues, or organized loneliness, has prepared men for totalitarian domination. So while she doesn't elaborate more fully on the idea of negative solidarity, her argument nonetheless sets up the opposing poles of solidarity and the masses, thought and logicality, solitude or togetherness and loneliness, experience and superfluousness, worldliness and uprootedness. It therefore seems to me that Arendt's notion of negative solidarity may be a useful framework for understanding our current neoliberal moment, which has engendered and proliferated a new structureless mass of furious individuals who feel isolated from each other and alienated from any sense of meaning that may once have been provided by the political. In this sense, rather than totalitarian or fascist, given all the skepticism around the term totalitarian, rather than totalitarian domination, we might think about the role that negative solidarity plays in preparing individuals for a new 21st century domination. I might suggest the term post-fascism, understood in the context of Enzo Traverso and Roger Griffin, writing separately, who distinguish post-fascism from neo-fascism and classical fascism. As Traverso writes in his recent book, The New Faces of Fascism, the term post-fascism, quote, helps us to describe a phenomenon in transition, a movement that is still in transformation and has not yet crystallized. The new forces of the radical right are a heterogeneous and composite phenomenon. They do not exhibit the same traits in every country, even in Europe. They have certain points in common, but are also very different from one another. Post-fascism belongs to a particular regime of historicity, the beginning of the 21st century, which explains its erratic, unstable, and often contradictory ideological content in which antinomic political philosophies mix together, end quote. That was several pages from the introduction of The New Faces of Fascism. So Roger Griffin has written similarly, and borrowing from Martin Blinkhorn, has theorized this phenomenon in terms of groupuscularity, this concept that he takes from Blinkhorn. And he writes, In the context of extreme right-wing politics in the contemporary age, groupuscules are intrinsically small, political, frequently meta-political, but never primarily party political entities formed to pursue palingenetic, i.e. revolutionary, ideological, organizational, or activist ends with an ultimate goal of overcoming the decadence of the existing liberal democratic system. The groupuscule has the Janus-headed property of combining organizational autonomy with the ability to create informal linkages with or reinforce the influence of other such formations. This enables groupuscules to be seen as forming a non-hierarchical, leaderless, and centerless, or rather polycentric movement with fluid boundaries and constantly changing components. This groupuscular right has the characteristics of a political and ideological counterculture rather than a conventional party political movement, and in an age of relative political stability is ideally adapted to the task of perpetuating revolutionary extremism, however utopian in pragmatic terms, end quote. Sorry, that was a long quote, but it's a long definition. There's a rhizomatic quality to the groupuscule that he writes about. And he provides several historical examples, including the Wehrsportgruppe Hoffmann and various groups that coalesced around the Turner Diaries, for example. Kathleen Belew also has a book called Bring the War Home that I think documents a number of these groups in the context of the US and like white power movements. So back to Griffin, in extreme cases, he writes, quote, the groupuscule has made decisive contributions to turning disaffected losers into fanatical lone wolves ready to carry out ruthless acts of terrorism directed against symbols of society's decadence, whatever the cost in human life, end quote. So in this sense, individual terrorist actors, school shooters, quote unquote incels, and so on, may share a personal sense of injustice, but they do not struggle together to overcome it. Rather, isolated individuals comprising increasingly radicalized groupuscules act on impulse, and their actions in turn give license and permission to others to do the same. We might say, therefore, that these groupuscules are connected through a kind of negative solidarity, which he calls the sort of, what is that term from physics about sort of what's in, like the black matter or something like that? It's not black. Dark matter, yeah. He calls it sort of like this dark matter. He uses this dark matter metaphor. So we might say that these groupuscules are connected through a kind of negative solidarity that can then in turn be capitalized by political parties who publicly distance themselves from the terrorism but nonetheless benefit from it. In his essay, Rousseau identifies four concepts of positive solidarity in Arendt's political theory. Exclusive, which are limited to those who are suffering from exploitation or oppression. Inclusive, which includes those who suffer but accommodates those who make common cause with them. Universal, the different peoples who collectively make up humankind. And natural, which pertains to the family, and which I'd like to look into more, but I'm not going to come back to in the context of this talk. But with all the talk around family that's been going on today, I think there might be something really productive there in this notion of natural solidarity. So in Rousseau's reading of Arendt, negative solidarity emerges at the moment of a breakdown in universal solidarity as a result of the, quote, unstable compromise at the heart of the nation state between its function as the expression of the will of nationals and expression of legal and political equality between different peoples, regardless of national origin and relative power position. And so the ensuing crisis of statelessness, which paradoxically and illogically denies human rights to those human beings who are not part of a nation state, signals the limits of rational thought to encourage the potential of universal solidarity. Negative solidarity might thus be more precisely understood as negative universal solidarity, insofar as it describes both the negation of universality, rejecting the universal rights of man, as well as the negation of solidarity, rejecting a, quote, world which mediates the concern of one with the suffering of another, and enables concerns and compassion rather than pity to be the feeling one experiences. So this negative universal solidarity is embodied for Arendt in the figure of the mass man, whose, quote, self-centered bitterness is repeated again and again in individual isolation and is based on no common interest, economic or social or political. The feeling of being expendable was a mass phenomenon, end quote. Rather than common interest, negative solidarity connects mass men through the repetition of self-pity fueled by fury and apprehension, rage, conspiracy theories. In other words, such self-pity is a simulated oppression that brings with it its own tyranny of logicality, resulting in the worst cases in isolated acts of terrorist violence. So, like the mass man of fascism, the groupuscule of post-fascism, if we're going to set up that comparison, is also connected through negative solidarity. Whereas the fascist man generates negative universal solidarity that contributes to a sort of sadistic imperialism whereby the will of the people is externally imposed on the world, the post-fascist groupuscule generates what I'm suggesting maybe is negative exclusive solidarity, whereby the will of the people is realized and imposed on the world from within. That is, groupuscules experience a simulated oppression, the feeling of superfluousness and worldlessness that leads to real loneliness. If the individual ultimately commits an act of violent terrorism, we might say this is due to a lack of solidarity and the critical rational thought this necessitates. It is, in effect, a rejection of the possibility of exclusive solidarity from the place of such solidarity or the simulated place. If we assume the premise that the state is failing to provide a framework for togetherness with oneself, which Arendt describes as solitude, or with others, solidarity, that has led to the formation and proliferation of groupuscules and groupuscular violence, how then might we imagine new forms of solidarity that might curtail this while also safeguarding against the temptation of post-fascist palingenesis that undergirds the ideologies of so many extreme right groupuscules? And so here, there's many places we could go, I suppose. And as I was thinking about this, I was drawn to the work of Donna Haraway, who's written really quite extensively throughout her career about radical kinship, from coalitions through affinity in its early iteration in the Cyborg Manifesto, to her more recent notion of staying with the trouble in the Thulu scene. And so in this book, Haraway argues for sympoiesis rather than autopoiesis, of creating with others rather than creating oneself for oneself. And sympoiesis strikes me perhaps somewhat ironically as an inspiring antidote to groupuscularity, which I see as fundamentally autopoietic insofar as it's centered on the simulated oppression of an individual or of the making of an oppressed self. Recognizing the collective creative potential we have within and because of our entanglement on a dying planet does not require a reliance on the welfare state, nor does it require ethnic isolationism or economic nationalism or anything else. Rather, I would advocate for a social and economic system that enables radical queer solidarity, which could liberate and empower individuals to identify our chosen family beyond any limiting normative factor, and thereby transvalue existing markets so that we can work collaboratively in these collectives towards creative pursuits across all sectors of human invention. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you so much, Chet. We have time for questions from the audience, specifically to Chet. Yes.
For Chet, when you talk about sympoiesis in contrast to autopoiesis, in your work, does different notions of power ever come in? Is that a concept that gets discussed in the making, perhaps, of a world network of mutual aid with others? I mean,
so what is the role of power?
Power
Dynamics?
Does it come into play? Yeah, power dynamics. Yeah.
I think there can be. I think there's room for sort of a playful or a playing with power dynamics, or sort of a playful deconstructing through simulating and queering of power dynamics that can occur in those spaces, in those sort of creative spaces. Yeah.
Cool.
So I suppose it does. Yeah.
Jeff, thanks for your question. Anna.
How is Mass Man produced?
How is Mass Man produced?
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly is that question getting at?
You
Just so I make sure I'm
described like
answering it correctly.
this way of relating, this affective way, this
Mhm.
that becomes a societal phenomenon, right?
Mhm.
it doesn't just happen. Does Hannah Arendt have something to say about how it is produced?
Yeah. Well, it comes from the breakdown of the class system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, is what she says, which leads to the breakdown of a party system because it can no longer represent class interests. So it really is sort of like Marxist in that sense. And so
production of groupuscules is similar, you say?
I think that the production of groupuscules is not necessarily class-based, although it could be. But this is sort of describing again a phenomenon that's happened in the wake of sort of the end of European fascisms. Is sort of the way in which these movements have sort of like proliferated into these like decentered or sort of polycentric corpuscules, or like slime mold is another metaphor that he uses. And so like in Kathleen Ballou's book, she writes about sort of the various sort of white power or white nationalist groups that have sort of sprouted up in different sort of places and times that are not directly working with each other per se. Yeah, so it's sort of a description for that sort of, if that makes sense. And there's a palingenetic sort of revolutionary quality or desire, I think, in them to some extent, that there's like this rebirth of a national community that we see under fascism. It's just not centralized. It's sort of decentralized.
The first question was short, so we'll take one more, and I'll put you on the queue then for common discussion.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your paper. I'm wondering about how you're thinking about Donna Haraway and this kind of choosing your community, the queering of community thing in relation to specifically, I'm thinking of something like Standing Rock and the communities there where you have kind of the liberal choice-driven folks who are like, I can choose whatever my community is, versus an indigenous community where it's not so much that they've chosen to be in that community, it's an intergenerational thing that they're trying to keep some sort of survivance with.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you see those kinds of tensions working out in the ways you're thinking about
Yeah,
things.
I mean, it's a really good question, and it does get at some of my own limits of sort of indigenous epistemologies and so on, to be able to really speak to that. But I think there's like this sort of notion of like allyship or something where it's like you're not choosing an identity or appropriating an identity, but one can still enter into a kind of what Arendt would call like more inclusive solidarity. But whether one is like has permission to lay claim to that as like some aspect of their own identity, I think is a complex question. Yeah.
Continued. We have as our third speaker, Kenneth Johnson from Valdosta State University, speaking about subsidiarity for mutual aid. Question, a replacement for the welfare state.
Well, first, can everyone hear me? Great. Well, I should like to thank the folks at Telos for inviting me to come and speak with you today. It's always a great way to start off the year, even though it's in February. The title of my talk today is Subsidiarity for Mutual Aid, a Replacement for the Welfare State. Thus far, our conference has featured various discussions about the rationale for and features of mutual aid, with appropriate historical instances where this has occurred. I would take it for granted that mutual aid is a good idea based on the charge that was given to the contributors of this conference about the defects of the welfare state as it is currently constituted. However, I would like to focus on what needs to happen to make mutual aid work. I will assert that in the American context, any program of mutual aid, with the word program being considered as a social project rather than an actual set of policy choices for implementation, that this must address individuals and groups in terms of notions of identity, social status, and participation. I will advance the idea that to overcome the social divisions in modern societies about how the social product is to be divided and distributed, subsidiarity is needed to make that work well. Let me start by describing a set of real events that tend to happen throughout America among thousands of elementary school children. Please visualize a group of children playing on a playground. Sometimes the children implement forms of hierarchy and dominance in their relationships. This can be readily identified when a child decides to assertively dominate his or her peers in a bossy way and boss them around. Sometimes the gambit works. At other times, the bossed American children will reject that attempt at dominance and will provide a 6-word retort. That retort is, "You're not the boss of me." I'll repeat that. You're not the boss of me. Please reflect on that statement. It compactly contains notions of self-assertion, autonomy, self-respect, personal agency, and personal sovereignty. It resists claims of social dominance in any way being legitimate. It could be described as an incipient legitimation crisis, at least in regard to a bossy child. In the political sphere, we can look at the American Revolution, where the rebellious colonists deployed a motto, "Don't tread on me." On flags and on handbills, this motto was often accompanied by a drawing of a snake. The point being, if you step on a snake, the snake will turn around and bite. I believe this is the essence of the current forms of political disquiet, especially among nationalists, nativists, and others who are tired of being bossed around and not being consulted, much less being engaged in participative and deliberative democracy in terms of matters that affect their lives. We need a concept to help manage this alienation, especially when engaging in mutual aid, and that concept is subsidiarity. The concept of subsidiarity in the context of political order and governance seeks to have power and resources located closer to those who are most affected, and by implication, requires participation by those affected in the crafting of policies and decisions. The word itself was first used in 1936, although the concept has earlier and deeper origins. It has been a part of modern Roman Catholic social teaching, and is often paired by Catholic social ethicists with 2 other priorities: solidarity, which refers to the human and to the bonds of connectedness across people and people groups, and the common good, that is the notion that instead of the sovereign individual subject as the sole source of legitimacy in the social order, there is instead a notion of benefits and help in common, and a notion of responsibility to social entities larger than oneself. The philosophy of subsidiarity has emerged in other forms aside from Roman Catholicism and predates it. For example, the ancient Hebrews implemented a form of this during the Israelite sojourn in the wilderness of Sinai, where Moses is reported to have delegated his authority to lower levels to provide for the day-to-day governance of the emergent nation. The Christian scriptures describe an incident where the new worship community was divided with the distribution of food to widows, Jewish versus Greek, where the Greek widows got the leftovers or nothing at all. The solution was to establish the diaconate, with persons who would supervise food distribution in order to free up the apostles to do the work of study, teaching, and leading worship. Comments this morning by Benedict Kohler portrayed the way mutual aid traditions were present among the Abrahamic traditions And Wade and Hudson noted the presence of these approaches in Asia as well. Closer to our time in the West, Edmund Burke advocated for elements of localism, with a notion of diffused powers instead of a centralized state structure making all the decisions. In the American Revolution of 1776 and thereafter, notions of federalism, regionalism, localism, and particularity were the common aspirations of most of the states and many of the framers of the Constitution. Sometimes this notion went farther than was expected or desired, in that the American Civil War in the 1860s was a case where the southern states, as seceded, decided against what they viewed as ongoing centralizing tendencies toward a true national government, which in their minds were a mortal threat to the institution of their economy of black enslavement, in addition to other religious, economic, and cultural divides that drove the two sections of the country apart. More recently, political philosophy has begun to reinterrogate the norms of centralism that have been central to 20th century political thought in the West. One example in the US was James Burnham, a Marxist turned conservative, who in the 1940s asserted the rule of managerial elites was a growing danger to small r Republican values and virtues. Our own period has offered similar concerns. Thinkers as disparate as the late Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas both criticized bureaucratic trends in modern society, with Habermas writing of a legitimation crisis in the late 1960s, as many ordinary people began to distrust and disbelieve in the accepted narratives of the societies they lived in as lacking legitimacy. Habermas went through an exercise of creating a new variant of political engagement to overcome this problem, that of communicative confidence, yoked to the objective of deliberative democracy, where in an ideal speech situation, everyone in a society would be enabled and entitled to exercise undistorted communication in order to make their claims upon the body politic. The founder of Telos, Paul Piccone, held forth early and often about overcoming both managerial capitalism and government centralized bureaucracy in favor of cultural particularity, autonomy, and the like, in order to defeat what he called artificial negativity. This is wherein government would identify perceived injustices or other causes of complaint, and then anoint itself as savior to ameliorate or eliminate abuses by establishing regulations and vast bureaucracies to monitor compliance and punish violators. In opposition to organic negativity, when there were genuine problems that could be resolved with the least restrictive means possible, artificial negativity, as Piccone implied, would gin up grievances in order to give a continuing purpose for the state to get involved. The cast of new-class intellectuals that the late Alvin Gouldner identified had a similar role, as did Christopher Lash's criticism of the rule of experts that sought to infiltrate into every ungoverned social relationship, especially that of the nuclear family. Some observers feel that the welfare state in the U.S., while having many of its functions devolved to states, still has inordinate and unaccountable influence in Americans' daily lives through the billions of dollars in federal largesse distributed to the states in support of a social safety net. Unlike policy analyst Sergeant Shriver's directive in the 1960s federal model cities program that required that the government program provide for the, quote, maximum feasible participation of the poor, close quote. Today, no one seems to ask about the recipients of welfare state benefits, about their opinions of the aid offered, how it is distributed, and whether or not it is concretely helping those in need of it. Sometimes economic crises afford the federal government an opportunity to remake parts of the financial and social orders in the U.S. This was the case during the Great Depression, during which Franklin Roosevelt created a plethora of new agencies to deal with almost every condition that was created by the Depression. In 2008 and thereafter, President Barack Obama sought to restart the economy in the midst of the Great Recession by manipulating funding flows to the state to demand certain changes in exchange for the money. A process that scholars of public administration describe as coercive federalism. As his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, once said, quote, "Never let a serious crisis go to waste," close quote. Now we can ask, what is going on with the rancor and resentment of so many in American society? Is it a coincidence that the disdain for a narrative of mutuality, care, cooperative solidarity, and the common good is now commonplace? Not only in the US, but in other Western countries like Great Britain, France, Poland, and Hungary. Some of our colleagues at this conference support mutual aid as the solution for failed welfare state promises, whose failures have extended to a transnational and globalist sphere. But aside from the problem of finances and taxation, what else might endanger a mutual aid project and program from taking root? Rising nativism, assertive nationalism, often linked to ethnicity, race, and religious belief, has been spreading like an airborne virus among Western countries to infect their body politics. The welfare state was somehow supposed to create solidarity in response to human needs and take the edge off of financial and health insecurity. It is likely that the capacity for complaining about the welfare state is itself an epiphenomenon of societal well-being, in that overall, when compared to past epochs, current Western countries have gotten wealthier, cleaner, and safer, notwithstanding that there is room for improvement. Somehow the social engineers of the welfare state forgot two vital aspects of personal human existence that underlie daily life, that of identity and status. While human beings may be drawn to attitudes of covenantal cooperation as a default position, as Marsha Powley this morning noted, it also seems true that people today seek to define themselves in terms of autonomy, self-assertion, and sometimes a definition of oneself as part of a group distinct from other groups. This may underlie Carl Schmitt's notion of a friend-enemy distinction, and may also align with some anthropological observations of social sorting into in-groups and out-groups. Economic class has long been one of these sorting bins. Social status is another. Race and ethnicity are big factors in sub-sorting, with racism as a modern construct arising relatively recent in the West, either in the late Renaissance or as part of the European Enlightenment. People derive meaning from these categories, even as they are sorted into group identities. Cultural and linguistic identities meld with ethnicity, that is, national origin. For example, there is a perceived identity difference between a Flemish-speaking Belgian and a French-speaking Belgian. If you were in Cameroon, you would likely take a stand as being either a French-speaking Cameroonian or an English-speaking Cameroonian. Identity assigns status, and status is related to notions of group and personal honor and respect. It also relates in our current era to notions of self-assertion and personal sovereignty. This is why I've offered the example of Bosnians and its rejection among American children. People in the contemporary world increasingly demand recognition of their personal and corporate identities, and when this is denied, it eventuates into its own legitimation crisis. The welfare state, as currently constructed in the West, has failed to acknowledge its citizens' notions of identity as tied to the nation state, along with notions like race, ethnicity, and cultural factors like language and religion. This is why the US, Britain, and many countries in Europe have withdrawn the welcome mat for refugees, especially those coming from the Middle East and Africa, and for those of different religions like Islam. In the US, this rejection is both culture-based and race-based regarding migrants from Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the case nearly though all of these migrants identify as Christian, some Roman Catholic, and some Protestant, with the Protestants being mostly Pentecostal. Unfortunately, the nativist evangelical solicitude does not extend to these people, their own co-religionists, in a manner repugnant to the Christian gospel, Jesus' own teachings, and the older Jewish tradition of welcoming the stranger. These white conservative evangelicals, who might be better described as white religious nationalists, are an example of Americans who are trailing their inner identity as white people, without regard to the transnational and transcultural notion of a Christian community that extends not only through physical space, but also through time, past, present, and future. Their responses, along with that of other Americans who think likewise, exhibit resentment and fear. Tired of being bossed around, they and others from the conservative side of the street resist notions of the common good or redefine these notions to exclude and not include others. These others are not deemed worthy to partake of a common national narrative and identity. This is why any move towards a mutual aid schema has to address people's identity needs. One way to do this is to focus on subsidiarity in order to get decision-making power and resources closest to those most affected. If their buy-in to the new social arrangements are obtained, this will likely ensure greater acceptance of the outcomes since people were consulted. Subsidiarity in the US could be extended to notions of cultural particularity, regionalism, and a true federalism that no longer seeks to boss people around or denigrate their cultural and regional preferences in obedience to a centralized, alienating, and stultifying conformity as demanded by institutions of government and by what the critical theories used to call the culture industry. The progressive left in particular seeks to inflict its cultural preference on other Americans without consultation or accountability. Cultural institutions using mass media communication tools, including social media on the internet, now exact levels of conformity that rival the tools deployed by government. In this way, centralization is empowered and subsidiarity diminished. No program of mutual aid is possible until and unless those on the receiving end of it can have a say in its administration. Any policies must respect the dignity and meet the status and identity needs of its participants. One consequence of this is that it may mean having to come to terms with elements of cultural subsidiarity that might make us uncomfortable. By having to tolerate other Americans' different views about identity and other controversial matters like ethnicity, race, class, and gender and sexuality. If centralized coercion cannot work, and it seems to fail in America, then perhaps we need to look at subsidiarity in the form of regionalism, localism, cultural particularity, and a generous rather than coercive federalism as the means of creating and deploying mutual aid. We might consider inviting the active participation of the mediating institutions of civil society, like civic groups, houses of worship, and other entities, to move towards new forms of mutual aid, leaving behind only the large and difficult tasks that subsidiarity cannot effectively handle to the remnants of the centralized welfare state. Thank you so much for your time.
At the risk of being the boss of anyone, I will say we can take two questions specifically for Kenneth, and then I will open the queue for questions to any and all of our panelists, beginning with Sam, Anna, and the gentleman who might be there. Oh, in that case, beginning with Anna. Cheers. Question specifically for Kenneth. We have among our panelists on this panel about new political alignments, an argument that the new political alignments that we're witnessing stem in part from the very successes that the welfare state sought to achieve in liberating individuals from traditional structures of oppression. We have an argument that some of the new political alignments we're seeing come from the cultural dynamics of post-fascist, let's see if I can try this one, corpuscularity, namely the dynamics of negative exclusivity, and an argument that the new dynamics we're witnessing come in part from the welfare state having forgotten issues of identity and status, of forgetting that needs to be addressed through the principle of subsidiarity. We open the floor first to Josh.
Yeah, for Ken. As it concerns bringing people into the decision-making process, right? Particularly, you said recipients of mutual aid or aid specifically, and how there are certain organizations on the ground who are more capable, who have a sense of, I know that with emergency distribution, that religious communities are directly brought in. In fact, the FEMA and National VOAD teamed up for like a $75 million disbursement because the recognition that the regional distribution is better handled by. I'm wondering if you could give some examples in terms of mutual aid beyond like, that's just what came to mind for me in my personal experience, like, yeah.
Well, the U.S. has always had a long tradition of voluntary relief. I mean, before there was a welfare state,
Right.
you know, people were still here,
Yeah.
but they had to get help somehow. So you went to your synagogue, you went to your mosque, if there weren't that many mosques, and certainly you went to your church. Or if you were secular, there may have been secular groups that were doing the work.
Right.
But you know, there just wasn't a whole lot of government around. You know, national defense and the post office. That was pretty much about it. Over time, of course, as the society got more complex, you've had to add some layers. In terms of some practical sources of mutual aid that would work in a subsidiary context, housing worship helped, community organizing helps. I remember Sulkunen in his book, I think it was Rules for Radicals, he said, you know, don't do anything for anyone that they can do for themselves.
Mhm.
Because he knew that there was risk of dependency and where the giver called the king rather than those who are receiving. And there may be, because our society is more complex, many other citizen-led groups or forums. It might be, you know, a bowling club, it might be a biker group, you know, fraternal and sorority groups, whatever it might be. But your question gives a major insight that those who are closest tend to understand what's going on. Those who are distant tend not to understand. So if you, let's say, housing, you find Habitat for Humanity, and they build houses. That's all they do. They know the community, they know the person who's actually going to get the house. They are, in the most direct manner, you know, engaging people and meeting need. The conservatives have a term, effective compassion. Well, I don't necessarily agree with all their ideology. They have a point in that, you know, the more involvement, the more engagement, the more likely that the interventions are going to be successful.
Terrific question, terrific answer. I have Anna first on the queue, unless there are people who have questions specifically for Kenneth. Anna.
This is for Pekka. I love your use of Myrdal, who I just started reading, but I'm wondering if you can direct me to a reference for your use of the word intimacy. You said intimacy defined as having something to do with authenticity and difference, and I'm doing some work on things related to interpersonal intimacy right now and found that really tremendously exciting, the way that you described that. Could you point me towards somebody who's writing in use? Okay.
I'm using this pair of concepts, autonomy and intimacy, in a book that was called The Saturated Society. The title refers to the process I was talking about. The welfare state, when it has been successful, it produces autonomous individuals, right? Mm-hmm. Giving people resources to make their choices. But then on the other hand, when people feel autonomy, then they also start claiming for the right to be different, to be authentic, to be unique persons. And unique persons cannot be just numbers or equal members of society as citizens, which have to have equal status in order to be autonomous. So these are kind of opposing aspects of individualism, contradicting each other. And this is what I think is one of the key contradictions within the welfare state. This is why it arouses so much criticism, objections, and so on. And the counter side of this is the contradiction between the state. It's two functions. One is to protect autonomous individuals, to make sure that everybody has the same rights and same resources to make life the way that they want. But on the other hand, the state is somehow, when it does this, it's somehow bound to define the content of the good life too. And how to deal with these two aspects of the state is a problem. It is sort of the other side of the same contradiction. Equality, sameness on the one side, and difference, intimacy, authenticity, being separate from other individuals as persons, and so on. So this is the contradiction. I published an article in Telos journal in 2011, which was called Autonomy Against Intimacy. This is about the concepts.
Other questions? Yes.
My question goes to the three speakers, and it is focused on the connection between welfare state and identity, or the national identity. And the question is whether enduring welfare policy is possible without precondition of national identity, of national solidarity. In other words, whether welfare state is sufficient to create solidarity without the national aspect, without other criteria of collective identity.
Excellent question. Who would like to begin? It's obviously a major question in the Scandinavian countries.
Yes.
Well, yeah, this is a very, very important issue, and one which has aroused much debate and discussion. Welfare states in the 19th century were very clearly nationalistic projects in Europe, not only in the Nordic countries, but everywhere, in Britain too. And so the problem with nationalism in a globalized world has become quite severe. What do we do with immigration, with populations getting mixed, and so on? So one of the reactions is neo-populism. In the Nordic countries, the neo-populist movements are always very strongly nationalist, and they are exclusive. They want to keep the welfare state to us. One of the neo-populist discourses is precisely about keeping out the welfare beneficiaries. We have earned the money, so we want to use it for our needs and not for anyone else. So this is one of the most serious issues about the welfare state in Europe today, I think. It's a very important point.
Kenneth, I take you as saying that some kind of mutual aid, whether either at the local or national level, requires particularistic identity, and it's a good thing too. Is there?
I would think so. I think it also depends on the program. So for example, and here in the US, it's very contested. So for example, Social Security benefits. So everyone who has a job is supposed to be paid into that fund. And theoretically, everyone should be entitled to draw from it. But there's a strong view among some, especially among some of the very conservative folks, that look, even if you're an immigrant, if you're not like a legal permanent resident, so anything below that status, much less if you're not here with documentation, you should have no right to access that money, even though you might have paid into it. And this is for citizens only. Education, another issue, very contested. You go along many of the southern states with an influx of recent Latino immigrants, and the schools are getting crowded. And so parents start complaining, hey, schools are crowded. We don't have enough money to fund, robust learning, and it's the immigrants' fault. So instead of raising taxes to boost the education, they say, hey, we don't want to pay any more taxes. Why are these people here anyway? So I think that you have to have some sort of a durable national narrative, some sort of idea that, look, we're all in this together. And in the case of immigration especially, it gets really back to the Jewish tradition of openness to the stranger and welcoming the stranger. And yet somehow that has been forgotten, especially by...
It doesn't work anymore.
Well, yeah, right. No, that's true. I mean, Israel, I understand, especially if you're from Black Africa, you're not getting in. They're going to put you out in the desert, Dimona, or someplace, and you're going to stay there, and they'll give you a one-way ticket to anywhere else in Africa, but you're not staying in Israel. No matter whether you're a refugee, no matter if you're escaping oppression, tough luck. And I think there are obvious, concerns. Maybe some of them are legitimate. I've never been to Israel, so I don't know on the ground what's going on. But all that's to say, you need a narrative which ideally encompasses at least all the citizens, and maybe extends outward to residents as well, and then some sort of policy about those maybe going out here legally that would even extend further, get your arms around it. But this is the vigorous debate in California. It is rigorous debate right now, and most of the people are willing to let folks in and pay for them, but there's a strong group who would prefer to frog march people back across the border and love the current presidency that is attempting to do that.
Chet, can particularistic identity ever be a modality of mutual aid, or does it always necessarily exhibit the dynamics of negative exclusivity?
Well, I was going to go back to, as I'm thinking about that, in response to this question, is the way that the welfare state and welfare has been so weaponized politically, and that the logic of capital and neoliberalism has opened up this opportunity for certain beneficiaries of that system to weaponize the notion of welfare, which can then, as sort of my argument that I was trying to lay out, which can then sort of induce, theoretically, this kind of loneliness and isolation that Arendt is talking about, that in a sort of post-fascist landscape is decentralized and polycentric and so on. And so that's I guess that's kind of how it. I mean, Nazi propaganda films made the one aspect of Nazi propaganda was that this was an economic burden for Germany. That Jews needed to be annihilated because they were an economic burden on the German people. And that's a logic that I think has persisted, which is why I'm trying to why I've sort of approached this somewhat genealogically, is that those individuals who are a burden on my tax dollars or your tax dollars or something that are the way that welfare has been weaponized in a very extremely racist way in the 80s, especially 70s, 80s, and so on.
We have lots of time for a similarly encompassing and productive question.
Let me
Excellent.
Let me piggyback onto your comment that stimulated me about the particularity and how do we hold a fragile national narrative. So you'll hear on conservative talk radio and also among the white conservative evangelicals complaining about Muslims. Muslims in the ceiling, Muslims under the bed, Muslims everywhere. People, too many, they're growing. And some of this is perhaps, legitimately fear about terrorism and so forth. Others, some of it is just plain old nastiness. So they're concerned about Muslims. Well, there is a solution to that. Right across the border, in our southern border, we have hundreds of thousands of people who are Christians. Half of them are Catholic, the other half are Protestant, and maybe Pentecostal. They would be happy to come over, probably not even make any claim for social benefits. They just want to get away from whatever they're trying to escape from. If you let them in with a controlled measure, you can solve that problem for at least 2 generations, maybe longer. Just in terms of the birth rate, in California, we have a problem with construction workers. We don't have enough. People having to wait to get their houses built because there are just not enough people. You go to anywhere in the South where people are trying to pick crops, and there are not enough people to pick the crops. And again, I don't want to sound overly utilitarian in this regard, trying to use people for our economic purposes. But I think there are some productive things that people could do if they were allowed to enter. But for some reason, these evangelicals' vision is just so uncreative. That would be one way to address concerns about Islam and Muslims. Let the Christians in.
Further questions? Yeah.
Kenneth, when you talk about subsidiarity as a way to deal with identity and status issues, when we're talking about particularism, we're talking about citizens and non-citizens, do you imagine that the local deliberations involved in subsidiarity could overcome some of the contradictions between those groups under a more centralized welfare system? I don't know if I'm asking this clearly, but that in the deliberative arena, status and identity could be worked out in a way that promotes mutual aid between groups, essentially.
I think it could be worked out. If we don't have a discussion, if we don't have a deliberation, then nothing will happen, and hostility will continue to engender. I personally know people, friends of mine, they're white, they're older, working class, they feel excluded from society, the culture has seemed to have passed them by, and they're angry about it. Now, they're not ready to burn a cross or go out and kill people or anything like that, but there's a lingering resentment, and it's because of policies and procedures which are being done to them without their buy-in, without their consultation, without any voice. And so that is why I insert subsidiarity as one solution, one salve to try to heal that alienation. Now, there is a tricky part though. It doesn't always work. So for example, throughout the American South, when a lot of the big social welfare things were passed, like Social Security, it was decided, okay, anybody who pays in will get it, except that if you are a domestic worker or a farmer, you can't contribute to the system and you can't get access to it. Well, why was that? Well, the Southern legislators says, look, we don't want black people getting a hold of any of that. Therefore, we will make sure that legislation is crafted to exclude them. And for many years, that's exactly what happened. So in that sense, there was deliberation. It's just that there was a power dynamic where those who were more nasty won the day. Now, if we did it today, it might be a different story. So there's always a risk in deliberations, always a risk that things may not work out the way that you might want it to work out. But if you do nothing, then it is likely to fail anyway. Because you have all these people with all this resentment and anger and everything else building up, feeling excluded, disrespected, and diminished in their status. This is why it was a North Carolinian who said during the most recent election in 2016, he said, we voted with our middle finger. So, and I suspect in this new election, people will be voting with 2 middle fingers because they're so energized and so angry about opposition to the current administration. So we have to really be aware of of what's going on and do all we can to try to dampen the fire if we can.
Josh?
I was wondering, this notion of querying the politics, right, in terms of solidarity, I was interested in that because it seems that inevitably through deliberation or any other process, those are at play, and you want to build in protocol safeguards so that mind isn't right, or it seems that in my study of religion, right, charisma always has a way of privileging one group over the other at the expense of the other. And so what would it look like to sort of queer the political process, to change that up, right? And to recognize the particularity, not flatten it, right? I'm thinking about Kierkegaard here, right? To not sort of flatten things out existentially, but what would it mean to acknowledge, particularity, and at the same time build in some kind of mechanisms. I'm not suggesting this hasn't been done. I'm just curious what you think about it. Anybody?
Chet, would you like to?
Yeah, I assume that was directed at me.
Yeah.
That was it really is something that I would like to think more about. I'm not sure I have necessarily a prescriptive answer to that important question, but I think this idea of sort of enabling spaces or creating spaces or making room for these sort of non-normative chosen family-esque sort of collectives to trans-value existing sort of markets through some sort of artistic or aesthetic production. Like whatever that would look like, it's very abstract in my mind, I think, still. But there would need to be space, I think, like radical space opened up for radical possibilities. Like Donna Haraway's "Make Kin, Not Babies." So like taking this idea of sort of family and sort of putting this sort of queer kinship spin on it, that could potentially be interspecies, and as she writes about as well. But some sort of collective, productive action in those spaces, that's sort of what I was thinking.
Yeah, it seems that there was this movement in the first century, right? We talked about the early church, right? That something like this occurs because there is a breaking with previous, structures, bonding, covenant, right? There's something happening. There's a reformation or a queering that's going on in that period of time. And I don't know what kind of model but it's happened before it happens, right? So I'm kind of curious how to think about it.
And it's like an antidote, I guess, to this sort of like loneliness, isolation, and alienation that can be fueled by this kind of fury and apprehension or apprehensiveness, and that could potentially make one more susceptible to the weaponizing of the welfare state. I don't know. Like there's some sort of like togetherness in that idea, that in Haraway's idea of kinship, that I'm drawn to as connected in some way to mutual aid, it's still something that I'm thinking through. And that I as I was working on this sort of argument about grupuscularity, sort of like occurred to me, might be a productive alternative or antidote or something to that. Vaccination against that or something like that.
With thoughts of kinship, I would say that we have had in here a very serious and searching panel. But now it's time for coffee and then our first keynote address. Let's take a moment to thank again our